welcome to our joint IEEJ KAPSARC COP26 side event toward net zero emission pathways using the circular carbon economy framework. As you may know, under the Saudi G20 presidency, Saudi Arabia proposed the circular carbon economy framework, and it was endorsed by all G20 countries and appeared in the Riyadh Summit Leaders Declaration. It again was recommended in the 2021 Rome G20 Leaders Declaration. The CCE, or the circular carbon economy, is an essential framework for a low carbon economy, and today we explore this concept in two main sessions. We'll start with a welcome and scene setting, and then we'll look into the circular carbon economy scenarios for global energy transition, and then measuring the circular carbon economy, the 2021 CCE index. First, we start with the welcome and scene setting remarks by Fahad Al-Ajlan, the president of KAPSARC.
Thank you, Nora. It gives me pleasure to share with our audience, wherever they may be, that 2 years after launching the concept of the circular carbon economy, we're here at COP26, taking the next step in the development of the CCE framework. The CCE framework was launched in 2019 as a concept. It was a thought, a comprehensive framework that aimed to address climate challenge while also looking at socioeconomic progress and economic development. The current framework that was in place to address climate change was expensive, did not take into account national circumstances, and therefore did not fit. And so the circular carbon economy came as a way of trying to address this, address the threat and challenge of climate change, but also trying to continue the economic development, which is important, especially for developing nations. The circular carbon economy framework rests on the 4 pillars: the reduce, which incorporates energy efficiency, renewable, and others; the reuse, which is reusing CO2 in several applications; the recycle, which takes CO2 and incorporates it into other form of material, whether CO2 to polymers or other usage; and finally the remove, how to remove CO2 from the natural cycle, whether through CCUS or through nature-based things. When we started this discussion back in 2019, the whole idea was around how can we actually move from a concept, a framework, into actually implementation. And the 2 sessions today will shed light on this. But before we get into those sessions, I just wanted to mention a few things. The recent report from the IEA on net zero scenario, a pathway, looked at hydrocarbon demand. And even in 2050 and beyond, they see significant demand for hydrocarbon. And the same thing for several scenarios and several forecasts. Demand for hydrocarbon and fossil fuel will continue over the next few decades. And in order to have a smooth and orderly transition that facilitate the transition for many economies and many countries, it's important that we have a comprehensive framework that takes into account all the approaches, all the technologies, without focusing on one way and ignoring others. And so that's the beauty of CCE. The CCE takes into account national circumstances. What's relevant to Saudi Arabia might not be relevant to Iceland. What makes sense in Australia might not make sense in the UK. And that's the beauty of CCE. Therefore, we're moving the CCE now from just a conceptual framework, which is the product of many contributors, including KAPSARC, IEEJ, IEA, OECD, and others that contributed to this development. And we're taking it into the next phase. How can we measure implementation? And how can we advocate for a circular carbon economy as a path getting to achieving the climate ambition and getting to net zero? With that, I would like to thank you, Nora, and turn it over.
Thank you, Fahad, for this excellent backdrop and context to the event. Next, we have Tatsuya Terazawa, the chairman and CEO of IEEJ.
I welcome all the participants from around the world. As the chairman and CEO of the Institute of Energy Economics Japan, IEEJ in short. I'm honored to co-host the side event at the COP26 with KAPSARC, attended by President Fahad Al-Ajlan. First of all, I would like to pay my respect to the recent announcement made by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that it will aim for carbon neutrality by 2060. Since the establishment of KAPSARC, IEEJ and KAPSARC have been in very close cooperation. Last year, at the G20 hosted by Saudi Arabia, the concept of circular carbon economy, or CCE, was endorsed. IEEJ and KAPSARC played a very important role in developing this concept through T20, or Think Tank 20 Task Force. IEEJ welcomes this concept, and we would like to promote this concept further. Today, I would like to share with you a very quick overview of this concept. I understand that there are many people who might be viewing fossil fuel as the enemy in our challenge toward carbon neutrality, but I strongly disagree. The enemy is carbon dioxide and not fossil fuel. Fossil fuels could be our friend and our allies in our challenge toward carbon neutrality if it is used in a very prudent manner. This is the core message of CCE. I would like to explain why. To be sure, renewable energies should play a major role in our challenge toward carbon neutrality, but renewable energies are not almighty. They have their own limitations. First, not all the regions in the world can enjoy the full potential of renewable energies, especially in Asia. Asia, in particular, Japan, East Asia, and Southeast Asia, they all face constraints in using renewable energies. Asia in general does not enjoy the strong and constant wind flows that are available in Europe. The flat land used for solar panels would have to compete with other uses, such as farming in the densely populated Asia. The long rainy season in Asia would make it necessary to maintain a very large power storage capability. Renewable energies can decarbonize the power sector, but more than the majority of the energy demand is in the non-power sector. It is much more difficult to decarbonize the non-power sector by using renewable energies. To overcome these problems, hydrogen can provide a solution. Hydrogen can be produced from water using renewable energies in other regions. The produced hydrogen can be transported to Asia. This will enable Asia to use renewable energies in other regions in an indirect manner. Hydrogen can generate heat to decarbonize the hard-to-electrify sectors, such as in the industrial sector and the transportation sector. But hydrogen also has its own challenges. It is very expensive to transport hydrogen. In the absence of pipelines, you will need to cool hydrogen to below minus 253 degrees Celsius to carry it as liquid. This will make hydrogen very expensive. It is also very expensive to produce hydrogen from water using renewable energies. This is called green hydrogen. The high cost of electrolysis makes green hydrogen very costly. Ammonia can help us address these difficulties. If we can transform hydrogen into ammonia, we only need to cool ammonia to below minus 33 degrees Celsius to carry it as liquid. This will dramatically lower the cost of transportation. Ammonia can be produced directly from fossil fuels, such as gas. The CO2 byproduct can be captured and stored through CCS to decarbonize the ammonia. This is called blue ammonia. In our calculation, blue ammonia is clearly the cheapest option among the various types of hydrogen and ammonia. Ammonia can be used to be co-fired with coal to reduce the CO2 emission from coal-fired power plants. Ammonia can be used as fuels for vessels. Ammonia can provide heat to decarbonize the non-power sector. This is the reason why we are proposing a three-stage approach for CCE. Blue ammonia produced from fossil fuels, decarbonized by CCS, which is the cheapest option, will play the major role in the first phase. Blue ammonia can be co-fired with coal to reduce CO2 emissions from coal-fired power plants. Eventually, 100% firing of ammonia for power plants will be made possible. Ammonia can be used as fuels as vessels. Ammonia can provide heat for various industrial users. While ammonia is relatively inexpensive, there are uses in which hydrogen must be used. Fuel cell vehicles is one of such examples. For this reason, in the phase 2, we will also be using blue hydrogen, which is generally cheaper than green hydrogen. In the future, when the cost of electrolyzer drops substantially, green hydrogen can become a realistic option. This will open the possibility for the phase 3, where green hydrogen can play a broader role. I emphasize that this three-phase CCE approach is a pragmatic and effective approach to address climate change, especially in many parts of Asia. As you can see, fossil fuel is not the enemy. The enemy is carbon dioxide. Fossil fuels can be our friend and allies in our path towards carbon neutrality. The key is decarbonizing fossil fuels through blue ammonia and blue hydrogen. This is the essence of the circular carbon economy. Later in this event, more detailed discussion will be made about CCE. I sincerely hope that through today's discussion, the understanding about CCE could be deepened, leading to concrete actions. There are multiple paths leading us to carbon neutrality. I would like to stress once again that CCE, blue ammonia, blue hydrogen, can be one of the important and pragmatic approaches to realize carbon neutrality. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you to Tatsuya-san and the IEEJ, who contributed valuable contributions to advancing the circular carbon economy through the T20 and through other collaborations, including most recently in the Outlook. We will hear more from IEEJ in the next sessions. So next, we will look at the KAPSARC global CCE scenarios. In this session, we introduce the concept of the circular carbon economy and explore its potential role in pathways that reflect long-term, low greenhouse gas emission development strategies and for achieving net zero emission targets that are consistent with the Paris Agreement. This session showcases CCE scenarios that were produced separately by KAPSARC and IEEJ and sheds light on alternative global and regional roadmaps and perspectives in the transition of the energy system toward a net zero target. Mohamad?
Thank you very much, Noura. It gives me great pleasure to be here today and to showcase the work we've been doing at KAPSARC, looking at alternative pathways that would get us to net zero and to be in agreement with the Paris Agreement, or to achieve the Paris Agreement. So next slide, please. But before we get into the details over the next 10 minutes or so, I thought I would showcase some of the what we mean by the CCE framework. And I'd like to highlight that it builds very nicely on some of the principles that have been well established through the circular economy concept, which focuses on the minimization of waste and resource depletion by assuming that through the context of material flows. And similarly, the circular carbon economy is focused on, instead of materials, it's focused on the minimization of CO2 and other greenhouse gases leakages to the atmosphere that cause the warming level. And the other addition or the other distinction between the two is that the circular carbon economy also introduced the notion of remove, where carbon is taken out of the atmosphere and stored either underground or into the production of other commodities. So again, the notion is that you would want to account for the full cycle instead of going from produce to combust to leakage, that you would want to think about the management of CO2 from reduce to produce to combust, and then that CO2 or other greenhouse gas to be captured and then reused, recycled, and in some cases, it would be best to be removed through technologies like carbon capture and storage or nature-based solution. Next slide, please. So we've looked at different pathways, and if we look at all the current pledges made by the various countries to achieve net zero and through their updated national determined contribution, NDCs for short, what we find is that we are on a path that it would be insufficient to hit net zero by 2050, and it would be insufficient to hit 2 degrees, less than 2 degrees by end of century as well. And that's shown by the green line over here on the figure. We've also looked at different pathways that embrace the circular carbon economy framework, where we look at the possibility of achieving net zero, and here we're talking about net zero of CO2 emissions globally by 2050, as shown in the red line, and by 2075, as shown in the blue line. But still be within 2 degrees in the latter, and then being within 1.5 degrees with some overshoot. And what we find is, if you go to the next slide, please, what we find is that it would be achievable. And here I do a deep dive into one of the 2 scenarios where we hit net zero by 2075. So the way to interpret this figure on the far left, this is how much emissions we're emitting globally as of 2015. If we look at a scenario with no climate abatement whatsoever, then that's the additional emissions that we would have brought into the system by 2075. And then the next few bars are indicating how much we can shave off from those emissions, looking at various technologies from, again, repeating what Fad was saying about the remove and reduce and then reuse and recycle. We pretty much need all options on the table to be deployed at scale to be able to achieve that target, including removal technologies. Next slide, please. But saying that it's achievable does not mean that it will be a trivial task. I think the amount of work that we need to do between now and those years, or over the next few decades, is going to be massive. And just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, so looking at energy transition, we're talking about almost a doubling in the amount of energy, primary energy used over the next 50 years. And yet, we were talking about transitioning from being a fossil dominant of 85% or so in 2015 down to 44%. So again, a massive shift in the energy mix over the next few decades. But while doing that, we also were looking at, that would also require a massive increase in electricity supply with a higher proportion of electricity in final energy consumption, which currently is around 17% and would increase almost by threefold to roughly 50% of the final energy demand being met by electricity. So massive electrification across all end-use sectors, being buildings, transport, or industry. And those obviously raise a lot of challenges, as was pointed earlier. We're also talking about massive investments in renewables. Again, switching to low carbon futures or fuels would require massive investments in renewables. And we're talking about almost a doubling of the investments over the coming 50 years in comparison to what was recently achieved, which has been a record increase in the amount of investment. So we need to do much more than we have done, and we need to sustain those efforts over the next several decades to be able to achieve those targets. So again, while it's achievable, it's quite challenging to get there. So next slide, please. Then in the next few slides, we wanted to highlight the advantage of taking a CCA framework that is more holistic and would allow for all technologies on the table to be deployed at scale. So what we've done a quick comparison between scenarios that would get us to the same target, but with and without allowing for removal technologies in particular to be deployed at scale. And what we show is that in these few slides, on this slide, we show that the cost of mitigation, if you don't allow for these technologies to be deployed, or you don't invest in them now so they're ready to be used at scale when necessary, you're talking about somewhere between 20 and 94% increase in the cost of mitigation, which would amount to roughly about 2 to 2.6 loss of global GDP, in addition of what you would have done if you had all technologies to play a role. So again, massive additional cost if removal technologies do not come to scale to help us in solving the climate problem. Next slide, please. The other challenge, we're talking about massive increase in electricity supply and massive increase in renewables in particular. But what we show in our analysis, again, if you were to look at scenarios that allow and do not allow for removal technologies to be part of the solution mix, you're talking about an additional investment of 15% of an increase in investment in electricity supply. We're also, the other dimension to think about is that we're trying to transition away from, in the power sector in particular, if you transition too fast without the removal technologies, you're looking at a substantial increase in stranded assets in the power sector. And those are power plants that have been put in place and are forced to prematurely retire and be decommissioned before the end of their lifetimes. And as such, they bring a massive cost to different economies. And that cost would increase by roughly about 25% in addition in scenarios that do not account for removal technologies to play a role. The other dimension to look at is fossil resources, the revenues from fossil resources. Again, without removal technologies playing a role, we've calculated that an additional 20% of loss in resources or in revenues from fossil resources. And in the context of how much stranded fossil resources that are left untapped underground, we're looking at an increase from roughly about 73% to 83% of known resources globally. Next slide, please. The other aspect that I'd like to highlight, not only scenarios that embrace the CCA framework are more affordable, but what we find in our analysis, they're also more equitable when you're looking at the distribution of costs per capita across different regions. And here we're looking at the cost of mitigation and losses of hydrocarbons. And we show that the scenarios that embrace the CCA framework of all technologies tend to be more equitable as shown on these plots. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, these are some of the key takeaway messages that we would like to leave you with. One is that what we find in our analysis is that current pledges are insufficient to meet the Paris Agreement, and we need to be more ambitious, and we need to increase our ambition over the next years to put us on target of achieving the Paris Agreement. We also showed that using the CCA framework, we're able to achieving the Paris Agreement is still within reach, and it's doable, but it's quite difficult, and it requires a lot of efforts and across different sectors and by all players. Third, the scenarios that we've done looking at that embrace the CCA framework have shown that they are more affordable and they're more equitable. And last but not least, the climate problem is a global problem that requires a global solution where all actors and all sectors and all technologies have to be to play a role in solving this challenge. We cannot be technology agnostic, or we have to be technology agnostic. We allow for all technologies to play a role, which is exactly at the heart of what the CCA framework is calling for. With that, I thank you, and back to you, Noura.
Thank you very much, Mohamad, for presenting the KAPSARC view on the CCE scenarios. To complement this view, we hear next from the IEEJ.
My name is Yukari Yamashita from the Institute of Energy Economics, Japan. Today, I would like to share with you the result from our IEEJ Outlook 2022 featuring Circular Carbon Economy CCE scenario. This is a result from our latest Outlook. On the left is CO2 emission path for our two basic scenarios. One in blue is a reference scenario where current policies and technologies are assumed into the future. Another in red is advanced technologies scenario, which assumes maximum introduction of robust policies and foreseeable advanced technologies with public acceptance to tackle climate change challenge. Light orange band below refers to those CN commitments announced by over 120 countries and a region if they are to achieve the commitment in full. As you can see, these declared CN commitments bring CO2 further down, but just about to 50% reduction of the current level, which is equivalent to 2-degree rise, still far from reaching net zero. This is because majority of the CN declaration came from advanced countries plus China. Look on the right. The rest of the world, especially developing and newly industrialized countries, are yet to join the group. The chart on the extreme right shows why. Those countries which foresee emission increase and those which have not declared CN target are yet to enjoy economic development. They have lower energy consumption per capita, which means they are still expected to grow and they need room for more energy use. This is one of the reasons why our estimates show that we may not reach carbon neutrality by 2050. Another reason rises from lack of attention to a non-power sector. We tend to believe that CN can be achieved simply by shifting energy use to electricity and then by decarbonizing power generation. Even in Japan's discussion on basic energy plan, most of the debate focused on so-called energy mix, which is how to decarbonize power generation in the more electrified future. But it is only half the challenge. Let me explain with charts. The left chart shows primary energy demand of our two scenarios in 2050. Although we see more purple, which is nuclear, and green, which is renewables, remaining 60% are still fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas. Which sector will still use such a lot of fossil fuels? Look on the right. This shows which sector emits how much CO2 in our analysis. You can see that lower part of the bar showed in light blue will remain more or less the same level as now, while upper part of the bar colored in yellow shows huge reduction by 2050. Yes, blue part is non-power sector, which may have more challenges to decarbonize. Now, the trend of non-fossil energy use in the power generation sector is shown on the left. With solar and wind at the top in green, we expect very rapid and steady decarbonization in the power sector. On the other hand, non-power generation sector on the right, we see a very slow development in terms of decarbonization. The orange part of the bar is solid biomass, which represents traditional biomass used in rural areas such as wood, that they are expected to decrease over time, replaced by modern, more efficient fossil fuel energy. So the second and the big challenge is how to decarbonize non-power generation sector, mainly industry and transport. Our analysis on circular carbon economy or 4R scenario shows how to address both issues. The concept of circular carbon economy was introduced in 2020 at G20 with the presidency of Saudi Arabia, and it utilizes 4 Rs, namely reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. As I pointed out earlier, there are areas of energy use where direct burning of fuels are required, and for that, we are dependent on fuels such as coal, oil, and gas for these uses. Here is a concept to fully utilize fossil fuels while decarbonizing them. CCE comes into play. Out of 4R, I talk about the reduce part with hydrogen and ammonia today. As fossil fuels still have more than 80% share in primary energy demand in the world, we need to consider how to decarbonize fossil fuels and transit to this carbon neutrality world. Moreover, how to decarbonize not limited in power generation sector, but also in non-power generation sectors such as manufacturing and transport. That circular carbon economy scenario is important to consider for more comfortable transition. Hydrogen and ammonia are attracting attentions from around the world. As they do not emit CO2 when we use them, they are considered to be important options for energy transition. They can be used in many sectors not limited to a power generation sector, and they can be produced both from renewable power and hydrocarbon fuels. Green hydrogen is made from renewable power using electrolysis, while blue hydrogen is made from fossil fuels, especially gas, with CCS. The left chart shows different kinds of demands can be supplied by both blue and green hydrogen or ammonia, while right chart shows supply and demand of synthetic methane or fuel, which can be made from hydrogen and then used for heat and transport. The advantage of this is that we can utilize existing infrastructure such as gas pipeline or gasoline stations. Ammonia can be made from hydrogen. It is considered as the least costly carrier available at the moment to transport hydrogen. In fact, Saudi Arabia exported fuel ammonia to Japan last summer. Ammonia is also known for its additional merit to reduce CO2 if we coal-fire it with coal. In fast-growing Asia, there are many newly built coal thermal power plants. It is more costly to demolish them. Then why don't we utilize these new fleets by co-firing with ammonia, reducing CO2 emission down to LNG equivalent level, and then shift to 100% ammonia or hydrogen over time? I say that is a good start of transition. Look on the right. By using hydrogen and ammonia, we can reduce CO2 not only in power generation but also in non-power generation sector, and that does not change the primary energy demand too much, and there will be a shift away from coal and oil to natural gas as a feedstock for hydrogen making. For more drastic CO2 reduction, we will need decarbonization technologies such as hydrogen and CCUS in addition to existing clean energy technologies. Those which have declared carbon neutrality targets have means to cut further, and we may even reach 80% reduction level in CCE scenario as shown on the right-hand chart's lighter colored bars. But we should not stop there. We all know that climate change needs to be addressed globally, and we should not leave behind developing economies. In order to disseminate decarbonization technologies globally, we need to take further steps and collaborate internationally to share such technologies, or to make rules and standards for each relevant technologies. We also need to facilitate energy transition of developing world through financial and technological supports or human resource development. Such collaboration, I believe, will make us reach this carbon neutrality target together. And for that, technologies defined in circular carbon economy will greatly contribute. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you to the IEEJ for the scenarios on CCE and the KAPSARC view. Now we are opening the Q&A floor. You may raise your hand to have the floor. And in the meantime, perhaps Mohamad will start with you, the question on the CCE index. So you specified 2075 as the year to hit net zero in the energy sector. Is it at all possible to do so by 2050? What are the real challenges?
Thank you, Nora, for the excellent question. So if you look at the scientific wisdom on when do we need to hit net zero emissions to be within the Paris Agreement, the consensus is that we need to hit net zero by 2050 to be within 1.5 degree with some minimal overshoot. But by 2075, we want to get below 2 degrees in particular. So I've shown the case for 2 degrees. We've done the analysis for 1.5 as well, where we would actually we would achieve net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. So it is doable, but there are a few caveats to think about. One is, the amount of investments, I mean, I've talked about how difficult it is going to be for us, all of us, to be able to achieve net zero by 2075. By 2050 is even more challenging. And I think one of the big ticket item would be the amount of stranded assets that you would see, especially in the power sector, where many of these assets that have not reaped the full potential would have to go out of business to allow for new technologies to come in. But again, the amount of investments there would be quite substantial. The other thing to keep in mind is that we're only talking, these scenarios have only looked at net zero of CO2 emissions. We still have other GHGs or other non-CO2s that are still contributing. And without removal technologies in place, we actually, in our scenarios, we showed that it's not feasible to achieve the Paris Agreement if those technologies do not come to play in the second half of the century. So it is very critical, again, coming back to the notion of all technologies need to play a role in our solution to tackle the climate challenge. We need to invest heavily in these technologies so they are ready when we need them so direly in the coming decades. And I think that's something we've seen in our analysis in the 1.5, but obviously we only could show one given the short time period that we have.
Thank you very much, Mohamad, for this excellent answer. Perhaps a follow-up question. So carbon removal, as you mentioned, is an essential technology for a low-carbon future, especially for a carbon-neutral energy sector. Are the current prices raising the cost of energy transition? So how much more technology development is needed to happen before a reasonable price for a carbon removal can be achieved?
Yeah. Again, another good question, Noura. I definitely add in CCS would add to the cost, the current cost. And I think the current wisdom is that, again, we need to invest heavily to reduce the cost of these technologies. And one of the big themes that are being promoted by different thought leaders on this is that we need to move from the one pilot study scale to more of a hub style. And I know in Saudi Arabia, for instance, part of the Saudi target of net zero, we're talking about turning two cities, Jubail and Yanbu, as two hubs where we're taking this to the next scale. And I think we need to see more of these hubs come around where we can push the envelope on this so we're able to reduce the cost so they are viable when they're critically needed. And I think obviously there is the technology aspect. There's always, you have to think about the governance and the Article 6 implications, that you need to have the right environment, both in terms of the politically, but also in terms of governance, in terms of regulation, to allow for these technologies to come in play and to contribute to the climate solution.
Thank you. Perhaps a final question. So the world witnessed the first shipment of blue ammonia going from Saudi Arabia to Japan. And in Yukari's presentation, she mentioned the applications of hydrogen in non-power uses. Could you elaborate on that? What do you think of that scenario?
I mean, maybe I would defer to my colleague here, Takahiko-san, to talk more about it. But I would just say that hydrogen is going to be part of this, a critical component of the solution to the climate challenge, and especially in the hard-to-abate sectors, where without hydrogen, it's going to be extremely challenging for us to be able to mitigate climate change in those sectors. But maybe
absolutely. Thank you, Mohamad. Takahiro, would you like to elaborate on this?
Yes, maybe hydrogen, especially blue hydrogen, is very important for non-power sectors, especially for steel making. So maybe we use some large emissions in the transport sector. So the emission hydrogen is very important for non-power sectors. And maybe East Asian countries such as Korea or Japan or Chinese Taipei, we need some import from Saudi Arabia or blue hydrogen from around the world. So the blue hydrogen very important for Japan to in near future, I think.
Thank you very much, Takahiro. So I see that hydrogen and CCUS were highlighted as central technologies for your scenarios in the IEEJ, for the CCE scenarios. What other technologies did you consider in the scenarios?
Yes, we included some hydrogen and CCS and CO2 absorption in concrete curing or recycled CO2 in aggregate of the cement. So we input such a technology in the CCE scenario, and we got some good outcome for reducing CO2 emissions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So with this, we end the first session and we go into the second session on the CCE index with Mary Luomi. Mary Luomi, over to you.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. And thank you for joining us. It's my great pleasure to be launching today the first edition of KAPSARC's Circular Economy Index, Circular Carbon Economy Index. This has been a collaborative effort of various teams at the center. We developed it based on best practice in composite indicator development, which also included the involvement of dozens of domestic and international experts and stakeholders, and we're very grateful for them as well, including our International Advisory Committee. So it's my pleasure to present over the next 10 or so minutes the highlights of the index on behalf of the entire team. So if you can change the slide, please. Just a little recap. What is the CCE? Colleagues have already shown similar slides. It's a relatively new concept. As colleagues said, it's inspired by the concept of the circular economy. And so it tries to get away from this linear economy that results in CO2. And what we'll be focusing on, we focus a lot on in the index, are what we call these different CCE activities. So we've mapped them out here, and you'll see them on another slide shortly. You can change the slide, thank you. So in a nutshell, as was said by colleagues, the CCE is based on these 4 R's. It adds this remove to the 3 R's of the circular economy. It focuses specifically on energy and emissions. So it's, in essence, it's a mitigation framework. It's a holistic mitigation framework. So as in this CC index, as we understand it, it's all hands on deck. There's no silver bullet. So we need to think about pragmatic and economic solutions that are efficient and take into account different country contexts. The ultimate aim is to avoid atmospheric CO2 emissions, as we heard also from colleagues, and the ultimate goal is net zero emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. It was endorsed by the G20, and at the core of the CCE is the idea that each country has its own pathway. So we might have a country that has a lot more renewables in its net zero mix, but we have countries and also hard to abate sectors that will need more hydrogen or CCS, for example, as we've heard, and things like energy efficiency are also in the mix. So then the final point on this slide is, what is the CC index then? It's a tool. It's essentially a tool that's developed by us for energy and climate policymakers and stakeholders worldwide to help quantify and compare countries and their performance and their potential on the CCE. It aims to support domestic planning and decision-making in this nexus of energy, emissions, and the economy. And it also hopefully will enable data-driven discussions alongside these comparisons across countries. Kind of creates a common language and common metrics to be used across countries worldwide. Next slide. So the index has a framework that we're going to illustrate here. We are also making available today, in addition to a web portal where you can see all these results, we're making available the methodology. So I'll just give a very brief overview here to enable an understanding of what it is that we're measuring. So on the left there, you will see that half of the score for countries comes from their current performance. And what we do here is we measure both the diversity of engagements on these various CCE activities, i.e. all kinds of mitigation technologies that exist at the moment, but also how they're performing on these technologies and approaches. And then on the enabler side, what we do is we have 5 different areas into which we'll go shortly in in a bit, where we measure how countries are placed, what their potential is to make progress towards CCEs and net zero going forward. And then if you press onward, thank you, we have an add-on score that we create in the index that enables comparisons across oil producers. The reason here is that oil producers are a very specific group of country. They have a number of specific challenges because they have a lot of hard to abate in their economies. So we're enabling an additional comparison amongst these countries through adding a few additional indicators there. Next slide, please. So what can we do with the index? As I said, it's a tool for policymaking. It's not just about the rankings. I know everybody always loves indices and rankings and wants to see where their country is ranked. But this index is, as any other, intended to spur debate and support policy discussions and sort of contribute to learning and sharing lessons across countries. And so here's specifically what we think the index helps measure. One is, how can we create a language to measure the diversity of mitigation engagements across countries? Secondly, how are countries positioned to make progress? Where are the gaps? Where are their strengths? And so forth. Also, this index enables comparisons within sort of more homogeneous country groups and regions. And finally, we have this oil producers lens that I mentioned, where we can look at how their industries are positioned towards CC transitions and how they're performing with carbon circularity at the moment. Now, next slide. In this first index, we have started with a smaller group of countries. The reason for this is that we need a sweet spot between availability of specific indicator data and the ability to make comparisons across these countries. What we did, therefore, is we have 30 countries, all the G20 members are there, all the G20 member countries are there, and we have 20 major oil producers, minus Libya, because for Libya we have low data availability. You can click forward, Noura. Thank you. So there you see the countries that then get the oil producers lens score. A total of 37 indicators, all quantitative indicators from harmonized international data sets, plus then we have these 10 oil producers lens indicators. And the next slide. I'll give you some high-level messages before turning to the scores. Well, you'll also see the rankings, and if you're from one of these countries, you'll see where your country is ranked. So the key message is obviously, as we all know, significant work remains ahead. So this index shows a large number of gaps within and among countries, which you'll see shortly. The top three performers, which are Norway, UK, and Germany, they receive the highest scores on both of these dimensions of the index, current performance and future potential. In the area of current performance, we see the highest contributions to country scores coming from energy efficiency and then renewables and electrification. And in terms of enablers, we want to highlight gaps. The biggest gaps in particular between countries are, as one might intuitively also perhaps expect, when it comes to net zero or CC transitions, they are in policies and regulation, technologies, and finance and investment. And also, we think that it's important to have this a bit more perhaps experimental part of the index that we're hoping to develop further going forward to see how oil producers can make these transitions and how they're faring compared to each other. So now to the slide, the scores and the rankings. Here you see the first CC index, and next year we'll have an updated score. The winners this year are Norway, UK, and Germany. And here I simply wish to leave you the message that, as you'll see, there are large differences even among these major economies in terms of how they're both positioned at the moment and what their future potential is. And we need to keep this in mind because it's critically important to bring all countries along. So international cooperation will be critical to reach CCEs and net zero. Next slide. If we look a bit more closely at the performance, and here we see all the performance indicators where you will also, by the way, find all this data on the web portal. We'll share a link with you shortly. So we're making all this data available, and you will see exactly where these scores come from. But we measure performance through these different CCE activities. And you'll see that the top performers are the ones who have strong engagement in at least 4 or even 5 of these different technologies. And again, there are big differences between the top and the bottom. In the enablers area, again, major differences between top and bottom performers. As you will see, in the 3 first areas, policies, technology, and finance, we see bigger gaps between the top and the bottom. So socioeconomic contexts and business environments, energy security, their countries are performing a bit more evenly. So we'll give you some highlights on these 3 first sub-indices. In policies, what we're doing, we're measuring how regulatory frameworks and policies support energy efficiency, renewables, CCS, and natural sinks. And as you see there are big differences in performance. Same comes to reporting of emissions to the UNFCCC, which we're using as a proxy to measure reporting. And then finally, climate change policy as well overall. In technology, there's again significant differences between countries. If we look at the specific indicators, we see the biggest gaps in CC patents. In particular, this indicator measures largely renewable energy patents. Academic publications is another area of huge differences between countries, as is trade in high technology. On finance, there we see big differences, in particular in the area of investing in renewables and other CCE technologies, sustainable debt, and carbon pricing. And here, just to pause a bit, I think it's a very, very steep line there, as you see. Again, very crucial to look at those countries at the bottom there and keep in mind the need to bring everybody along this transition to net zero. Then a couple of slides on the oil producers lens. Here we add 5 additional indicators to the total scores. And as a result, this year at least, with this mix of indicators, we don't see a huge change in the rankings of countries. But we see some interesting trends there. We invite you to look at them on the website and in the publications. There's one thing we wish to highlight here on the next slide, which is that when we plot the enablers dimension, so the CC potential-oriented dimension there on the x-axis, we plot it with the country's dependence on fuel exports, so oil and so forth. We see a clear correlation here, which means it could be read to indicate that the countries that are able to diversify, that are highly dependent on oil revenue at the moment, as they diversify, they will also be better placed to transition. But this is simply an example of the kinds of results that can be drawn from this index, and there's many more in the report. Now finally, we simply also want to leave you with a few sort of snapshots of the kinds of comparisons that we can do. So it's important to keep in mind that we have a mix of countries here, developed, developing, from very different climatic regions as well. And so here we see a bit of that comparison. And on the next slide, we have done a breakdown for how high-income OECD and high-income non-OECD countries rank on the index, and then also how middle-income countries rank. And income, one might ask, how big a difference does it have on the score? The correlation is about 62%, which means that 1/3 is explained by other factors. So it's not just about how rich or wealthy or developed you are. There are other factors also in play in terms of determining how countries are placed on the CCE and the potential. So recapping on the final messages, we see large variations between the bottom and top performers. There's a lot of unexploited opportunities and potential, areas for further work, and there are huge support needs of different types in even the major economies that we're looking at. Country circumstances are very diverse, and if you look at the performance sub-index more closely, you'll see that countries are applying different approaches to mitigation, to CCE, and they're also performing in different ways. And when we look at the top performers, as I said, they score high on a bigger variety of indicators. but no country scores high on all of those. So that just tells us about the diversity, but also the long way ahead. And same for the potential. There is significant potential for countries to scale up, all the way from renewables to hydrogen to CCUS. So that's carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And in terms of the enablers, we need more policies, we need more technology, and we need more finance and investment. Briefly on the next steps, we will update the index every year from now on. And this launch is not just the launch of the results, it is an invitation for experts, stakeholders to reach out and give us feedback. We would very much like to make this something that we can develop together and make useful for countries across the world, and we're hoping to also include more countries going forward. So more analysis also to come. We're launching a regional, we're doing a regional launch in January in Dubai, and so there'll be an interactive feature added to the website then. And on the next slide, you will see the website, which is now live. So feel free to go, click around, see where the index scores come from, see how your country is faring. There's a couple of screenshots on the next slide as well. So you'll see what it looks like. Very interactive, also works on your mobile phone. We have an amazing team who helped us put it together at KAPSARC, so hats off for them. And then finally, you'll also be able to find a number of publications, all the results, all the methodology, and all the underlying data is available there. So thank you so much, and we very much look forward to hearing your feedback and inputs and reactions.
Thank you very much, Mary, and congratulations on the launch of the CCE Index. Next, we have Takahiro, who will speak about measuring the, or who will give comments on measuring the circular carbon economy.
Yeah, thank you.
Over to you, Takahiro.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for presentation, Mari-san. So I'd like to have make a very brief and concise comment on the 2021 CCE index. So, so next please. So I think that my impression is that this CCE index is very interesting and unique and suggestive for the study. And I think this study has three important aspects. So first one is a comprehensive index. This is the very comprehensive index. So it incorporates very large, very broad range of indicators such as policy and regulations, macroeconomy, financial markets, and science and technology. So it is very, very distinct from the existing studies because existing studies are very limited in the scope to something about, for example, in energy or environmental indicators. So this is very comprehensive study. And second one is it's very rich in enablers score. So enabler score is very important, and it includes, if we use objective assessment for the study, maybe it is very good for the policy makers to consider the possible policy and measures for CC policy and measures. And the third one is the oil producers' lens score. Maybe it is very will provide some guidance for the transition to the net zero emissions or carbon neutral society. So it's very useful scores for the policy makers in oil producers countries. Next, please. This is wish list for Mamari-san. So first one is I like you to continue this CC index on a regular basis or annual basis as a fixed point observation. So maybe we can use such an index for the development of study of policy development. And the second is, so this is just a study of the CC index, but we just know about some roadmaps or stages to reach such a realized CCE in the future. So I like to have some researches on roadmap for the CCE. Maybe there can be multiple different pathways to achieve the CCE. So it is very the good roadmap. And the third one is this CC index study includes 13 countries, but I hope that the more, especially Asian country, will be included in this study. So, for example, Indonesia included in the study, but we like to see other ASEAN countries and Bangladesh or Taiwan, Chinese Taipei. So this is my wish list to the study team of CC Index. Next, please. And last questions to the Mari-san. So first one is the scores for China, and it is very my impression about maybe the score of China is a little bit underestimated. So especially this study says some countries such as China need significant improvement in the natural sink policies, but China is the largest country in forest growing stock increase. So maybe I like to know about how to estimate scores related to China. And the second one is blue hydrogen, and green hydrogen is included in the CCS performance score, but blue hydrogen is captured in CCUS included. So maybe my suggestion is to make blue hydrogen explicit from CCUS to maybe blue hydrogen, very important aspect of the CC study. So this is my questions to Mari-san. Thank you very much.
Takahiro, and with that, I'll also open the questions to the floor. And perhaps meanwhile, I'd invite Mary to reflect on the questions that were raised by Takahiro. Would you like to, over to you, Mary?
Absolutely, that's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Takahiko-san, for the overview and the very kind words. You were very, very kind with your review, I think, on the index. And reflecting on your points, I first wanted to share that the plan indeed is to update the index every year. And with that, we might add new indicators, and we're likely to do that because what we want to do is to provide the best available estimate. And that is only possible if we have the best and most recent available data. But as we do that, we will then start creating data series or time series as well. So the indicators might change, but we'll also be able to make comparisons on how countries' results change over time. Research on the roadmap, I think, is a fantastic idea, and perhaps this is an area where KAPSARC and IEEJ and perhaps other institutions too could explore some collaboration. And also the plan is to increase the size of the sample of the countries. So we will be thinking about criteria, whether it's economic size, whether it's data availability, whether it's a representative sample of countries from other regions. So that is the plan. Now to your questions, I think these are precisely the questions that we as index developers are hoping for. The first group of questions that we are hoping to get as a result of this index and putting it out there is, what is behind my country's scores? Why is this country performing not so well, or perhaps even why is it performing so well on this indicator? And so specifically on China, I think you referenced the carbon sinks. That specific indicator comes from the Environmental Performance Index, and there is an ecosystem services score there. And it's an area where we know that there are huge challenges globally to measure carbon sinks. We've been in touch with the WRI. We reached out to the Yale University who's done this index, and there are difficulties actually measuring this. So this is an area where it might be that it is a data issue. That is kind of a short question I can give, but this is precisely why indices are also useful for supporting data-driven policymaking, because they point issues in data, and they might help improve data as a result. The second question about making blue hydrogen more explicit. Indeed, we received this kind of feedback from our advisors, and we did consider that. What we have there at the moment is a data set that was kindly provided to us by Bloomberg NEF, and data on CCUS, blue hydrogen and green hydrogen is very scarce. And we know that that's partly because these projects are only starting to get scaled up. So hopefully, as scaling up continues and we get more project data, hopefully we'll be able to separate blue hydrogen as well. At the moment, it's included implicitly through the CCS, because blue hydrogen has that element, but definitely an area to consider. So thank you so much for your feedback.
Thank you very much, Mary. I hope this answers your questions, Takahiro. We have a question from an online participant, Shirley Mamani from Peru. I quote, "In my country, many alternative energies are not used. What is the first step that underdeveloped countries should follow to have a good energy transition?" Any takers? Mohamad, would you like to take this question?
So I think one of the themes that we're highlighting and embracing as the CCA framework is that the transition is going to be different for different countries. So every country is going to have to play to their strength. And I think having a plan, and I think a lot of countries, we've heard from a lot of countries where they've committed to, let's say, a net zero target, whether it's 2050, 2060, 2070, we've heard recently from India as well. I think trying to put a strategy in place and then think through what's going to be the most economical for your region. Because again, as Takahiko and the IEEJ had pointed out, is that certain energy are not really well positioned in certain regions, like renewables in Japan and other regions are not really something you want to play to in your transition strategy. So I don't really have an answer in your particular context, but I think devising a plan and then put in the milestone or the steps and the policy in place to enable you to achieve those targets is going to be one way of thinking about how to tackle this challenge.
Thank you very much, Mohamad. And I think, as mentioned earlier by Fahad in the opening remarks, the circular carbon economy allows for different technologies and allows for developing and developed countries to utilize different pathways to reach net zero. Back to you, Takahiro. You mentioned in your comments and remarks that China's score may be underestimated given its record in natural sink. Can you perhaps elaborate and provide more details on China's activities and carbon sink?
Yes, so China has a large amount of large areas of forests, and China is in do effort in extending the forest areas as a national project. So according to the Global Forest Assessment Report by FAO, China is a leading country in the forest stock increase. So maybe that, but I see some very small scores in the ICC index in natural sink. So I'll be a little bit just how this is the what the data set was used in this CC index. I a little bit wondered that views.
Thank you very much, Takahiro. I think it's great to hear of the afforestation, nature-based solutions in China. Also in conjunction with Saudi Arabia, which recently announced the Saudi Green Initiative and the Middle East Green Initiative for afforestation of 40 billion trees across the region. Perhaps the next question to you, Mary. The 4 Rs is the DNA of the CCE, as we know. How did you map the 4 Rs in the indicator, especially for cross-cutting technologies such as hydrogen?
Good. We are dealing with a concept that in many ways resembles both the circular economy and sustainable development in mind. When we started off the project, we did a conceptual analysis, and we found out that, as for so many other concepts, there are a few different conceptualizations already out there on what actually falls under these 4 Rs. And if you were paying close attention to our different presentations today, you may have seen some of these differences. So it is very clear that remove means avoiding emissions in the first place. And that everybody agrees is energy efficiency, it's renewables, both bio and non-bio, it could be nuclear energy, it could be switching to lower carbon fuels. Then we come to recycling and reduce. Now the concept that we in our team have followed is that recycling means carbon neutral solutions. So you recycle carbon through, for example, bioenergy, and then reuse would be binding carbon to things such as construction materials that Takahiko-san was talking about. However, in this specific area of reuse, as we know at the moment, solutions are not yet being scaled up at large scale. So in that area, we have a gap in the index framework. Other areas are very well covered. Then we come to the remove part, and that's where you remove CO2 and prevent it from going to the atmosphere. There we have CCUS, we have natural sinks, and each of those have an indicator in the index. And then we put 2 cross-cutting, one of them is hydrogen, and we're measuring green hydrogen there. Green hydrogen can be produced in theory both from bio and non-bio renewables, and so that is something that we measure through what projects countries have there at the moment. And finally, electrification, both as an enabler and a control for renewables. And so there are countries where there are high shares of renewables in the energy mix, but these come from traditional biomass, which is a contributor often to deforestation and causes a lot of health issues. So we're using electrification as a control for that. So there's the 4 Rs in a nutshell.
Thank you very much, Mary. This brings us to the end of this joint KAPSARC IEEJ COP26 side event. Before we end, I would like to remind you of the upcoming events hosted by the IEEJ on November 16, the 3rd IEEJ webinar for the world. It focuses on IEEJ's research and analysis on global energy agenda such as carbon neutrality and other quandaries. You can see more information on the IEEJ website. And next, we also have an upcoming event hosted or co-hosted by the World Energy Council, the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, and KAPSARC. And these are the topics mentioned: the global CCE scenarios toward a net zero emission world, metrics for circular carbon economy transitions, key enablers for the CCE concept, technological, financial, and political considerations. And here is a list of some of the featured speakers. For more information, you can visit the KAPSARC website to learn more about how to attend this event, which will take place on the 10th of November here in Glasgow. With that, I would like to thank all our participants and attendees online. We've had an excellent discussion led by Mohamad Hejazi from KAPSARC, and Mary Luomi from KAPSARC, and Takahiro from the IEEJ, as well as the IEEJ speakers. Thank you very much for attending, and I wish you a good day.